Fadden and the Fairies, written by Lucy Jackson and read by Derek Jacobi. This is a fairy story which explains, in part, the magic of dogs, remembering, of course, that Faddie was an Irish Terrier. For all those magical dogs, and in memory of Issy, Zuli, and Beagie, and Bella. The Farm. Now, this is a fairy tale, so we'll need to begin with once upon a time. And that means a very long time ago, a little brown puppy was born in Ireland. Like his mother, Beth, he was destined to be a crofter's dog, which meant his home was a small thatched cottage surrounded by a modest amount of arable and grazing land. For small farmers, or crofters as they were sometimes called, were Mr. and Mrs. O'Malley. They grew potatoes and barley, kept a milking cow called Stella, a small gathering of sheep and goats, and some hens. They were very poor indeed, and only just managed to scrape a living. Their dog, Beth, was a shaggy brown terrier. She was an essential part of their lives, and a huge help in managing the farm. She was an excellent guard dog. No potato thief ever came near the patch, and no fox ever approached the hen coop. The silly old goats and rather nervous sheep were safe from intruders. No one ever stripped the fruit trees at dead of night. Beth was always ready for them, rushing about, barking loudly to see them off. She patrolled the barn, and few barley-thieving rats escaped her speed and attack. What was more, the O'Malleys and their little daughter Maeve loved her dearly. Mrs. O'Malley would say, "Beth is the best thing we have. She runs the place. She knows everyone and everything. We could leave Maeve with her even when she was a baby. They love each other and play together so happily. She saved our lives, too. I wonder how many rabbits Beth has brought home for the pot. Remember that dreadful winter when the snow lay for weeks? We might have starved if it hadn't been for Beth's hunting." One morning there was a small miracle at the croft. When Mrs. O'Malley came downstairs to stoke the fire and put on the porridge for breakfast, she found Beth still curled up in her basket. She wagged her tail, and her eyes were bright with excitement. There seemed to be something tucked in beside her. "What have you got there, Beth?" Mrs. O'Malley thought it must be another rabbit. She was astonished to discover one very contented, plump, brown puppy. "Beth, you old slyboots! We had no idea you were in whelp. What a miracle worker you are, and he's such a big, beautiful puppy. Thank you, clever girl. We could do with another dog to help you run the place." Maeve was thrilled and couldn't stop chattering and hopping about with excitement. "Do you think the fairies might have brought him?" she asked. "Do be quiet, Maeve," Mr. O'Malley said sternly. "Beth needs some peace to settle her puppy, and we mustn't interfere and upset her." But Beth had everything well in hand. In fact, if she thought they were ignoring the puppy for too long, she'd pick him up by the scruff of his neck and carry him to wherever Maeve was playing. "I think Beth is getting bored," Maeve said. "She keeps leaving me with the puppy while she goes off to chase the foxes." They called the puppy Fadden, and inevitably it became Faddie. He was a strong, energetic puppy, and there were many adventures and a lot of mischief. He chased the goats over the hill one day for the fun of seeing them run. Having watched Mr. O'Malley lifting a few potatoes for dinner, he decided to carry on and dug up every one in the patch. He pushed poor Stella into the corner of her shed, because it was great fun jumping about and dodging her horns. But she didn't milk very well that day, and Faddie was in trouble. Beth did her best to keep him in check. Although he had learned quickly about chasing rats, Mr. O'Malley said he was spoilt and a dreadful tease, and, worst of all, unreliable. Maeve was always making excuses for him. "That's not fair," she said. "He's only a baby, and if there had been a few more puppies, he'd play with them all day and leave Stella alone." But the most worrying thing was that he would stay out in the garden at night. He'd snuffle around, hoping to spot the fox or the badgers, and no amount of Maeve calling or Beth barking would bring him in. One night, they were all too tired to wait any longer. They decided to leave him to go to sleep in the shed or under the hedge. "Perhaps that will teach him a lesson," said Mrs. O'Malley. They'd worked hard all day and were ready for bed. Even Beth had come in and was stretched out in front of the fire. Now, Faddie had been hiding behind the woodpile, listening to all the fuss, but decided he'd wait for them to go indoors. He was now 7 months old, and longing to get through the farm fence and explore the woods he could see across the field. He dug a hole and managed to squeeze under the fence. Escape at last! He was so excited and pleased with himself, and headed out for the trees. A fox appeared suddenly from the shadows. He knew Beth well and had a great respect for her. "Silly Faddie, little baddie," he said. "I could eat you up, but I don't want to quarrel with Beth. She's stronger than I am." And he slunk off into the wood. A badger appeared from a set under an oak tree. "Go home, Faddie, little baddie, or we'll eat you for our tea." And he shuffled off, chuckling. Faddie saw a pretty little fawn standing quietly with her mother. She tiptoed towards Faddie and whispered, "Faddie, Mother says you're a little baddie. She says the fairies will take you away. Go home, little Faddie, before it's too late." And she tiptoed back to her mother. It was almost dark, and Faddie's courage was beginning to fail him. He thought he'd better find the hole he dug and crawl through and back to the farmhouse. Someone would surely let him in. But where was the hole? He had absolutely no idea. He'd lost all sense of direction, and the fence seemed to have disappeared. It was soon pitch dark, and he was getting cold and frightened. Where was Beth? Why was no one calling for him? Why didn't Maeve come? Poor little Faddie was lost. He shivered and sank down to the ground with his head on his paws, whimpering softly. The Fairies. And this is where the fairy tale begins. Now, you have to understand that Ireland in those days was jam-packed with fairy folk. They were called the Little People. There were pixies and elves, who did most of the hard work, goblins who lived underground and were considered thieves and mischief-makers, and sprites who lived in the treetops and looked after the baby birds. The biggest group, however, were the fairies, who made the flowers grow and lived mostly in tiny toadstool houses. They looked after all the babies, who were called the Imps. Faddie had heard about the Little People. He'd been warned by Beth often enough that they were known to steal the lambs and sometimes even a human baby. He'd heard the stories. As a tiny pup, he'd been aware of little rustlings in the garden and heard tinkling voices at night, but could never find the cause. He lay on the damp ground, growing ever more miserable, and the whimpers turned to wailing. Surely someone would hear him. Suddenly, he was surrounded by a silvery light. He felt safe and warm, and not a bit afraid. He thought he could hear sweet voices and laughter, like tiny silver bells. Something fell in a shower of light raindrops over his nose and ears. And Faddie thought he could hear tiny hands clapping in time. "Faddie, Faddie, come with us, you are caught with fairy dust." Pretty hands and faces seemed to appear and disappear, and Faddie knew at once it must be the fairies. "Faddie, Faddie, come with us," they sang again. "You are caught with fairy dust." Faddie was relieved to be rescued. He sat very still, except for wagging his tail to show he was pleased. He could see the fairies clearly now. He had never seen such pretty little people, with long hair and lovely faces. The fairies sang, "Our magic dust has made you light. Come fly with us all through the night." They scooped him up into a hammock made of cobwebs, which had been plaited into strong strands. Oh, he felt warm and comfortable, and not in the least bit afraid. Up, up into the sky they flew, gliding first over the treetops and then over the tops of the clouds. The fairies laughed and chattered and sang as they swung Faddie's hammock between them. Through the starry sky they flew. He began to forget Beth and Maeve and the farm. He knew only that he was beginning to love the fairies. As they flew nearer to the fairy woods, they seemed to be joined by more and more little people. Faddie peeped through the strands of cobwebs and saw a great crowd gathered on the ground to greet him. He wondered why some of the fairies were bigger than others and wore long flowing dresses, while some wore short little skirts that looked as if they were made of flower petals. Two fairies stepped forward at once and sang, "We're Mary Bell and Little Flo. We'll teach you all you need to know." "Thank you," said Faddie politely. "Are you my special friends? I'm beginning to forget, but I do miss my mother and my little girl called Maeve." The fairies, who always sang in rhyme, said, "We'll always be here to help you along. We'll teach you to fly and sing our songs." They gathered around, holding hands, dancing and singing, skimming the ground with the tips of their toes. Faddie's house. "Faddie, come and see your room. Tomorrow you can rest till noon." They took him to a small, cosy room, hollowed out behind the roots of an old beech tree. The floor had a carpet of moss, and there was a matching mattress and bed cover made of cobwebs and tiny bird feathers. Faddie snuggled down and was sound asleep at once. The sun was up when he awoke next morning. He wondered for a moment where on earth he could be. Up in a corner under the roots was a large black spider. "Hello, Faddie," she said. "Did you sleep well? I made your bed for you. Were you comfortable? If it gets torn, I can always mend it. The fairies call me Spinning Jenny, and I do a lot of work for them, making threads for this and that." "Thank you, Miss Jenny," said Faddie. "My bed was most comfortable, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing now." "Don't worry," said Spinny Jenny. "The fairies will soon be here. They'll show you their pretty houses, and you'll have some serious flying lessons. And they'll teach you to eat fairy food, so you'll never be hungry." "Oh," thought Faddie, I could eat a bowl of porridge at this moment. I'm so hungry. Spinny Jenny kept chattering on. Don't fuss, Faddie. You have lots of time to play. I heard that later on you are to spend the days with the Imps, and they're mischievous enough for any puppy to join in and have fun. Who are the Imps? Asked Faddie. They're our babies. They all live together and could become fairies or elves or pixies. Or goblins. It just depends on who claims them. But the imps who become fairies have little tiny wing buds and need to learn to fly safely from the start. Spinny Jenny was absolutely right. Faddie did have a lovely time. He pottered around in the sunshine and played about and learned everyone's name and where they lived in the wood. Mary Bell and an elf called Raffi brought him a pair of pretty wings, which would grow as he grew. They promised him he could sometimes take them off. He had to sit very still while they attached them. They visited him every day and brought him flowers for his room. They taught him to speak politely to the older fairies and not to play too roughly with the elves and the pixies. Beth would have been amazed at how polite he'd become. He learned to eat fairy food and grew bigger and stronger every day. The pixies tidied his room under the beech tree roots and tidied him up too, brushing his coat with a comb made of twigs. He was a great one for rolling, and his friend Jingle, who was a foxglove pixie, would complain, "Just look at you, Faddie, all covered in leaves again. I've only just brushed you." Sometimes Jingle had to ask his pixie friends to help. "Do be careful with your wings, Faddie. You're not supposed to roll on them." Flying lessons. The biggest task, however, was to teach him to fly. Now, you might think that fairies fly automatically as soon as they grow their wings, but not at all. They have to learn to fly, just as human children have to learn to walk. There are a great many tumbles and bumped heads along the way. The elves, pixies and goblins have no wings of their own, but they were very good at catching a lift, floating behind the dragonflies or butterflies, holding on to Spinny Jenny's web threads. But Faddie would have to learn to fly. He'd be no use to the fairies without wings. Mary Bell and Little Flo started him off. "Jump, Faddie, jump, you've learned a lot. Bounce like a rabbit, hippity-hop." Poor Faddie tried his hardest, but he fell on his nose, and then on his bottom. He landed on his front paws, and then his hind legs, and kept thumping and bumping his head. "I can't do this," he wailed. "Besides, who's ever heard of a flying dog?" Raffi offered to help. "I can't fly either," he said, "but I'll borrow some wings and we'll learn together." They bumped and tumbled around, and neither found it easy. Mary Bell and Little Flo decided to pick Faddie up and toss him across to each other like a ball. They thought it might just give him a feel for flying. "Head up, Fad, you're moving fast, you will learn to fly at last." "Wow!" said Faddie. "Wow!" said Raffi. "That felt a bit more like flying. Wow!" And he swished back and forth. "Wow-wee! Is this really me? Come on, Raffi, we can almost fly." After days and days of practicing with Raffi and their patient teachers, Faddie was airborne at last. Raffi, however, decided he'd had enough. But he had been of great help. He thought he'd better stick to asking the butterflies for a lift. Faddie proved to be an excellent flyer. Very soon he could hover and flutter, shift sideways and dive. As well as being tireless and swift, he could land perfectly on all 4 feet and take off again without stumbling. "You are so good, much better than I could ever be," said Raffy. Flo and Marybelle were very proud of him. "Faddie, you began at 0, but now you are a flying hero," they sang. "Well, thank you," said Faddie. "You were so patient, and it wasn't easy. I'd still rather run along the ground, but flying is useful. I can see that." The village. Marybelle and Flo took Faddie and Raffy up in the cobweb hammock to test whether he minded being up so high. He didn't mind at all, and was in fact excited to see the tops of the trees. He wasn't in the least bit afraid. But Faddie's first proper flight was to see the fairies' village in the woods. He flew behind Marybelle and Flo so as not to bump into the trees and tangle himself in the branches. He hadn't quite learned to navigate yet, whilst they could fly almost with eyes closed. Although some fairies lived inside the flowers, their little houses were mainly mushrooms and toadstools of every shape and size. It was the prettiest village. Faddie swept over them, hovering and peeping in at the tiny windows, waving to the fairies who were at home. He managed very well, and it was considered a great triumph for a first flight. The fairies were delighted, and invited him to go moonbeam surfing with them that night. This was their favourite game. When the moon was full, they'd fly up high, then slide down the beam of silvery light. They managed to heave Faddie up as high as they could, and then let him go with a whoosh. He loved it, sliding and diving. But he did have to be rescued once or twice when he fell off the moonbeam and into the darkness. The fairies caught him up, singing, "Faddie, Faddie, stay in the light. The dark will give you such a fright." The wise fairy. They were very excited to hear that the wise fairy, who made all the big decisions in the fairy wood, had ordered the fairy games for the next day. She wanted to meet Faddie at last and have a serious talk with him. "Oh dear," thought Faddie, "now what?" The truth was, he was fast growing into a fine strong dog, and the fairies had plenty of work for him to do. The wise fairies spoke kindly and said how much everyone loved him and how pleased they were that he'd learnt to fly. She explained that he could help the fairies in so many ways. There were often problems to be solved in the woods. The imps were becoming unruly, and there seemed to be no one who could insist on some discipline and good behaviour. The foxes had grown bolder and had struck up a friendship with the thieving goblins. Who knew where that might lead? The elves were exhausted trying to dig tunnels and holes underground to hide the winter stores. The pixies seemed to do little more than try on their flower hats all day, and hardly ever help with the gardens. The badgers often break down our toadstools simply because they can't be bothered to walk around them. But worst of all is the sea giant and our poor bees. The wise fairy looked very grave. "We don't like talking about him, Faddie. You will be a great help with everything else, but first you must join the fairy games and see what clever little people we are." The games. The games began with the fairies showing off the skills they'd learned from the dragonflies, hovering and dipping over the water. Then they fluttered upright, like the butterflies, and reached into the trumpets of the flowers to taste the nectar. They raced through the rushes to see which fairy could fly the fastest. But their favourite game was swallow diving. They had to catch the swallows as they swept past and hang on to their wing-tips, or the tips of their forked tails. Up, up into the sky they'd soar, letting go whenever they liked and twisting and tumbling down through the air, laughing and singing all the way. Some were clever enough to catch another passing swallow and soar upwards again. It was like a beautiful dance in the air, with the flashing blue of a swallow's wings mingling with the fairies' brightly coloured dresses. Everyone gathered to watch, not just the little people, but all their friends. Rabbits, hares, mice, deer, foxes, even the badgers would stand blinking in the sunshine. There was a lot of clapping and cheering after a really spectacular dive. Faddie was invited to show his best tumble, but he wasn't sure how he'd hold on to the swallows' tails unless he used his teeth, and that seemed unsuitable somehow. The fairies tried to persuade him. "Come on, Faddie, little Fad, you are such a clever lad." But Faddie wisely declined, and sensibly remained earthbound. The Imps. Faddie was very fond of the babies who were always referred to as the Imps. He knew they could belong to any one of the groups of little people, except for the Imps with wing buds, who would always grow up to be fairies. They all muddled about together when they were very young, sleeping in their leaf cradles, and rolling around and playing on the soft moss. When they learned to crawl and totter about on their tiny feet, they were divided into groups, and could be recognized by their caps, rather like schoolboys. The ones nearest to the village were the acorn imps, who wore acorn caps on their heads. The wise fairy was concerned about them, for they had grown very noisy and bold and not at all obedient. Their nearest friends in another part of the wood were the beech-mast imps. They were becoming unruly and noisy too. They are almost, but not quite, as disobedient as the acorn imps, but are very quick to learn their naughty ways. The fairies have had great difficulty looking after them, and are exasperated with trying to stop them wandering off into the woods and getting lost. The wise fairy explained to Faddie, "The imps love you, Faddie, and we think you could do an excellent job looking after them for a bit. You could teach them some manners, and how to behave and keep themselves safe. They won't stay in their beds and keep disappearing. We've lost several already, and think the goblins may have stolen them." "I'll try," said Faddie a little hesitantly, remembering what a handful he had been as a pup. He moved in with the imps, and there were squeals of joy from everyone. "Faddie's looking after us! That will be fun!" They climbed all over him, peeping into his ears and snuggling into his coat. If it got too tickly, Faddie would sneeze, or give a gentle shake, and they'd all slide down to the ground, squealing and laughing. "Help!" thought Faddie. "There are rather a lot of them. I hope I don't lose anyone." He need not have worried. The imps wanted to stay with him. He had time to play with them, and they all jumped about on their mossy carpet, trying to do handstands and head over heels. They played hide-and-seek around his legs, and he showed them how to play ball, rolling the acorns around. At bedtime, they were too tired to protest, and were soon tucked up in their oak-leaf cradles, feeling safe and happy with their dear Faddie asleep beside them. In no time at all, they were so well behaved that Faddie planned an outing for them, to visit their cousins, the beech-mast imps. He wondered how he could possibly get them safely through the woods. It was too far for the tiny imps to walk. Faddie thought hard and came up with the idea of the ivy coach. They found a branch of ivy, and each imp would have a place holding on to a leaf. They were very excited, and there was a fair amount of scrambling and a bit of pushing. "Now then," said Faddie, "line up quietly and hold on tightly. Anyone making a fuss will have to stay at home." They were quiet in an instant, and when they were safely seated, he called, "All aboard!" And there were squeals of delight as he set off at a brisk trot. The visit was a great success. They sang and danced with their little friends, and they all played together so happily. They rode on the ivy coach, which was exciting, and no one fell off. Faddie had taught the acorn imps so many games and tricks, and they were eager to teach their little friends. "This is how you walk on your hands and feet. This is how to do head over heels. This is how to spin round, holding hands," they cried. Faddie thought, these imps are naughty only when they're bored. They don't wander off because they want to stay and have fun. That is what I'll tell the wise fairy. The Badgers. One night, when Faddie had settled the imps in their leaf cradles, and he too was dropping off to sleep, he heard a scratching and a snuffling, and grass tufts being torn up and flattened down. He felt a sharp nudge in the small of his back, and then a thud on the side of his head. A very cross, husky voice said, "Move over. We're looking for roots and berries, and anything else we can eat. Who are you, anyway? Move away." In the darkness, Faddie recognized the white stripes on the badger's face. "Mr. Badger," he said, as politely as he could, "when you push your way through the woods like this, you break the little people's houses and spoil their gardens. It takes a long time to build a garden and mend a broken toadstool, and you flatten them completely in a moment." The other badgers were lining up, looking very cross and menacing. Now, Faddie was growing into a fine, strong dog, and he had the courage of a lion. He flicked up his lip just a little so that the badgers could see his strong teeth, and he rumbled and growled deep in his throat. "All I'm asking, Mr. Badger, is that you push another path through the undergrowth and don't break the toadstools and trample over the fairy rings." But the badgers began to grunt and push one another, jostling to see who would lead the charge against Faddie. The imps had woken up and were beginning to cry, "Oh, Faddie, save us, we're so afraid." "Right," thought Faddie, "that's enough. I'm not having the imps upset." He faced the badgers and gave two loud, bellowing barks. "Get back!" he shouted, and sprang towards them. The badgers had never, ever been told what to do by anyone, and were not pleased. They thought there must be some mistake, and started shuffling forward again. But the sensible old grandmother spoke up. "Don't be ridiculous," she scolded. "Of course we can avoid the fairy rings. We don't break things on purpose, but we can't see very well, and we're on top of them before we realise it. Come on, you sillies. It makes no difference to us if we have to go round them." She led them away, but called back over her shoulder, "We hear you're a great digger, Faddie. Come and help us dig out the roots under the beech tree. We want to build a new set and move some of the youngsters out. It will give us some room and a bit of peace." "Of course I will," called Faddie. "There's nothing I love more than digging." He scraped the ground with his front feet to show what an expert he was. "Just let me know when you need me." Faddie was a great help to the badgers, who never worried the little people again. The imps were invited to inspect the new set, and were very excited to see just how the badgers lived. They kept asking exactly which pieces Faddie had dug out. And Faddie had the perfect excuse to dig and dig to his heart's content. The Fox and the Goblins. The goblins were becoming a nuisance. They never did any work for themselves, but took over the fairy houses or shared a nest with the baby birds, being fed, warmed, and watered by the overworked parents. It infuriated the sprites, who were the guardians of the baby birds, and felt the treetops were their domain. Goblins are expert thieves, and regularly raided the elves' gardens and stole from their winter stores. Now, no one minded a little bit of stealing from the lazy goblins. After all, they were very amusing, and their naughty tricks did make everyone laugh. But unfortunately, they had made friends with a fox, who was helping them with their night raids. Instead of having to run through the woods on their own 2 feet, they would hitch a ride on the fox's back, then gallop off when they'd stolen as much as they could carry. The elves were distraught. "What can we do?" they cried. "We can't keep up with the fox, and we're afraid of him. The goblins plunder the vegetables and wreck the gardens, and the fox can carry 10 sacks of nuts and grain on his back in one run. We can't think of any new places to hide things, and there won't be enough food for the winter. Whatever can we do, Faddie? We sometimes borrow nuts from the squirrels, but even they are complaining that their stores are being raided." "Don't give it another thought," said Faddie. "Stay in your houses tonight, tucked up and safe, and I'll deal with these robbers." He made a plan to intercept the fox before he could reach the gardens, and found a good hiding place inside a hollow tree. It grew beside the elves' gardens, and he settled down to watch and wait. It wasn't long before he heard the naughty goblins shouting, "Faster, faster, Mr. Fox! Let's see how many sacks we can steal tonight!" followed by shrieks of loud laughter. But as they drew level with Faddie's tree, he sprang out of his hiding place, straight in front of the fox. There could have been a head-on collision, but the fox stopped dead in his tracks, and the goblins were catapulted over his head and landed right at Faddie's feet. Mr. Fox, of course, fled. He had not the slightest intention to battle with Faddie. In fact, he was amazed to see how much he'd grown, and he'd heard about how he'd sorted out the badgers. Faddie scooped up each of the goblins with his nose and tossed them, squealing and somersaulting through the air in the fox's direction. They were last seen running for their lives towards the woods. "On their own 2 feet! What a lesson!" Faddie chuckled. They disappeared until autumn had ended, and Marybelle thought they must be eating flowers and berries, as they would never have grown anything for themselves. Soon, however, the sprites were complaining that they had made themselves very comfortable in the birds' nests, and were being fed and watered by the kindly parents. "We've never had to manage such naughty fledglings," they said. "They won't settle in their nests, and are always climbing out on the branches where they could easily fall. Those goblins are a very bad influence, and we don't know how many eggs they've eaten." But when the weather grew colder, they arrived all smiles and bringing little gifts for the elves, some pretty pebbles and petals from the last roses. Speaking softly, they said, "Could we possibly exchange these gifts for a few sacks of nuts?" "Be careful," said the wise fairy. "It won't be long before they're back to their old tricks, for goblins never learn." The Elves. The elves were intrigued by the way the goblins had ridden on the fox's back, and begged Faddie to teach them to ride. Raffy, who had been so helpful when Faddie was trying to fly, was most persuasive. "We'll have to take it slowly," said Faddie. Not too many at once, or you'll fall off and hurt yourselves. I'll lie down, and you must hold on to my fur with your fingers and toes while I get up carefully." They were very quick to learn, and seemed to have a natural sense of balance. Faddie trotted them round like a circus pony. There was a lot of noise and excitement. "Can you run as fast as the fox? Take us over a jump, Faddie." "All right, lean forward and up. Steady now. Lean back. We're over." The elves were delighted, but it led to a positive craze for riding on everything that moved and could carry them. The rabbits, though willing at first, were soon fed up with being made to rear and hop about, then race each other, with the elves urging them on. They were not amused, and the squirrels were even more offended. They clicked their teeth, flicked their tails, and hissed, "Silly, silly, silly!" The wise fairy warned, "You mustn't worry the rabbits. Mrs. Rabbit is so kind to the imps in the cold weather. She takes them into the burrows underground, and we don't want to upset her. You'd better stick to Faddie. He tells me he's digging all the holes for the new stores, and there'll now be time for a sports day for you." "When? When?" they cried. Riding on unwilling squirrels was forgotten, and they all sat down together to plan the day. The sports day. Faddie was full of ideas. He was especially fond of the elves, and sometimes felt they worked so hard for everyone else and had very little time to enjoy themselves. Faddie, as we know, was born on a farm, and had watched the O'Malleys toiling from morn till night, growing vegetables, picking fruit, and making the harvest safe for the winter. The elves were the farmers and gardeners for all the little people. It was a most important job, but he knew how much they had enjoyed learning to ride, and seen how athletic they were, and how quick they'd been to learn. They deserved some fun, and a day off from their hard work, he thought. "We'll have running and jumping competitions, high and long jump, sack races, and bunny hop races, a skipping game where everyone can join in, and a tightrope walking competition. Spinny Jenny has already promised to spin us all the ropes we'll need, and she'll come along and supervise us," he explained. The elves clapped their hands and said, "We're starting to practice now. Watch these bunny hops, Faddie." The day was a huge success. Raffy won the tightrope walking, but Faddie thought Spinny Jenny had held the rope very tightly for him to make it easier. Little Flo won the skipping because Pixie Jingle turned the rope very carefully for her. Mrs. Rabbit had to be banned. She broke the rope so many times that Spinny Jenny had to mend it. She declared it was not suitable for a large rabbit, which Mrs. Rabbit thought was a great joke. Faddie was supposed to organise the relay race and was in charge of the tiny carrots they were to use as batons to pass to one another. Someone fell over, and there was a slight delay in starting the race. Faddie, feeling bored, nibbled a carrot, and then, by mistake, ate them all. "I do beg your pardon," he said, feeling not a little embarrassed, "but you could just clap hands as you pass each other. That would work just as well. Much better, really." Oh, Faddie. They were supposed to end with a tug-of-war, but again the rope broke, and Spinny Jenny was, once more, not amused. They decided to dance with it instead. The fairies and the sprites danced for everyone. It was a beautiful ballet in the air, showing off their best steps and shapes. The imps tried very hard to show how they'd learned to hop on one leg. Well, almost. They tumbled over, making everyone laugh. "What a lovely day," said Raffy. "It's the first holiday we've ever had. It's made us so happy. And now we'll be ready to work even harder in the morning." The rabbits. The fairies were great friends with the rabbits, who had burrows in every corner of the woods. The baby rabbits would often play with the imps and teach them how to jump. "Such well-behaved babies," the wise fairy would say. "So clever." One day she called Faddie and asked if he could make sure that the foxes did not chase the rabbits, who were their special friends. It's very important because when it's cold, Mrs. Rabbit takes the imps underground to sleep curled up with her furry bunny friends. She pulls out her own fur to make them cosy beds. She's so kind, and we haven't lost a single imp in the winter since the rabbits took over. Oh dear, thought Faddie. He never felt quite comfortable when the rabbits were about. He liked old Mrs. Rabbit and wanted to be kind, but sometimes he felt himself trembling and his nose twitching, and his legs would unaccountably bounce and jerk about. He could never quite make himself sit down. He confessed to the wise fairy that he feared he might start to run and chase them by mistake. "Perhaps you don't do quite enough running and chasing here, Faddie. I know you love to run. Flying is so light, and you sometimes want to pound the earth, don't you?" Faddie did some four-footed hops like a kangaroo. He started talking very quickly. "Yes, I often dream I'm chasing and running, and the imps laugh and say I flick my paws about and show my teeth. I'm not sure what it is I'm chasing, but I think it might be..." And Faddie thought he'd probably said enough. "Perhaps rabbits?" said the wise fairy. "And that won't do, Faddie. You might catch them, and there could be a disaster." "I know," said Faddie anxiously. "I'm very fond of Mrs. Rabbit, and she always lets me shelter in her burrow when we have a storm. I'm not very brave about thunder and lightning, and I can't hear the bangs below ground. But I'm not sure how steady I am with rabbits. Why don't we ask the hares to give you a good chase, Faddie? They're swift enough to keep well ahead, and love zigzagging over the hills. You could invite the fox along too and get to know him better. It could be a real treat for you." Faddie loved his days out hunting. He and the fox streaked across the hills, turning this way and that, tailing the hares. It was all a great game, and the hares would eventually run them around in a wide circle that brought them back to the fairy wood. Mrs. Rabbit, her babies, and the imps were always there to cheer him home. "Well done, Faddie! How fast you can run!" And Faddie, quiet and exhausted after his cross-country chase, could manage the rabbits without any trouble at all. And he did have a serious word with the fox. The Sea Giant. The little people had one problem which was so bad that no one liked to talk about it. Faddie found them shaking and trembling one morning and clinging to one another. The animals, too, were afraid and gathered into small groups. Even the badgers, who rarely came out into the sunlight, stood about, blinking their eyes, silent and anxious. "Whatever is the matter?" said Faddie. Whispered voices said, "The Sea Giant." "Sea Giant? What are you talking about? Who is this Sea Giant?" "We don't know who he is or where he lives," said the wise fairy, "but every few years he suddenly appears, striding out of the sea, making huge waves that flood the woods and the meadows and drown the rabbits and badgers in their burrows. The deer and the little fawns are washed away unless they can flee to the hills in time. Our villages and gardens are flooded. Sometimes the fishes and dolphins are washed up and stranded on the shore. It is a disaster, and no one knows how to stop him. All he wants is to steal the honey from the bees, but he breaks down everything in his path. He is taller than the trees, and we don't think he can see us. You can't imagine, Faddie, how terrible he is. Because we can fly, we're not in such danger, but we can't rescue everyone, and only the imps are small enough to carry up to safety in the sky. The fairies' pretty faces looked so sad. The wise fairy went on. The gulls say that he is on his way again, and the bees are already becoming frantic. Why don't they just sting him? Asked Faddie. They do, but he takes no notice, but just plunges his arms into their tree hives, pulling out the honeycomb and the baby bees, wrecking the hives completely. He carries a huge club in one hand, which he swings around his head, and the poor bees fall dead to the ground in their hundreds. There was a sudden roar, like bellowing thunder. The wise fairy called out, "Run, Faddie, run to the hills away from the seashore, and take everyone you can with you. We must fly away with the imps. Run, Faddie!" Faddie looked around, but there was no one to be seen. Everyone had fled or disappeared underground, terrified of the approaching giant. I need to have a look at this giant, thought Faddie, and he stood waiting on the shoreline like a sentinel. The sea began to heave and swell, and large waves crashed around him. Here he comes, thought Faddie, and he could just make out the most enormous man he could ever have imagined, looming up on the far horizon. Though the water was deep, it came only up to his knees, and he was swinging his arms in the air. Faddie thought he could see the dreaded club, and his courage almost failed him. Watching him stripping the beehives, with the poor bees falling dead around him, was indeed as terrible as the fairies had said. He crushed the fairy villages under his huge boots, trampling the woodland and drowning the burrows with the great waves he stirred up from the sea. The only live creatures Faddie saw were two distraught dolphins who had been thrown up on the shore by a swirling wave. Faddie rushed to help them, rolling them back into the water only just in time to rescue them. "Thank you, Faddie. You saved our lives. One day we may be able to help you." But Faddie's mind was on the sea giant. He followed behind him, barking and snarling loudly, but wondered if he'd even been heard. Nothing he could do stopped the sea giant for a moment. It took days for the little people, those that were left, to gather themselves and come out of hiding. They stood around with tragic faces, trying to comfort one another. Who was missing? Who had been hurt? Where were the dear little fawns, and the fox cubs, and the baby rabbits, and the badgers? The imps had been brought back, and, like human babies, they cheered everyone by playing happily in the sunshine, as the earth dried, and had no idea about the disaster. Faddie takes charge. "At least that's over," said Raffy. "It won't happen again for a long time." Faddie felt he had to take charge. He was fully grown now, and a fine young dog bursting with energy and action. "This has to stop," he thought. "This must not be allowed to happen again." He called everyone to a great meeting, not just the little people, but the birds and animals too, and explained his plan. "Now, what do we know about the giant?" he asked. No one answered, and then a goblin whispered, "Nothing." "Oh, yes, we do," said Faddie. "We know he lives in the sea, and, what's more, somewhere in that direction." A great murmuring started. Yes, but we don't, we can't, we mustn't. We must, said Faddie. Now, listen, everyone. We must find out all we can about him. I need some volunteers to fly across the sea and spy out where the giant lives. It may be dangerous, and we don't know what the world looks like beyond that horizon. We'll go, said 3 voices together, and Raffy and 2 collared doves stepped up at once. We're ready. Whatever the danger, just tell us and we'll do it. Everyone clapped loudly. Faddie explained, I know you doves can fly as straight as an arrow and don't dive and whirl about like the gulls, and you're very good at finding your way home. I want you to take turns in carrying Raffy on your backs and fly out across the sea and track down the giant and see where he lives. Then you must fly home and tell us all that you've seen. There was a great cheer as Raffy climbed astride one of the doves, and they took off at once into the sky. Up, up they flew. Hold on tightly, Raffy, Faddie called, and stay together. Keep your eyes open. Good luck. There was a gasp as they disappeared at last into a cloud. Faddie waited. They all waited, quietly and anxiously, as the day seemed to pass so slowly. He tried not to look anxious, but ground his teeth inside his beard. At last, just as the sun was setting and Faddie was becoming desperate, 2 specks appeared out of the sky. They grew larger, and in moments 2 utterly exhausted doves fell to the ground. Quick! shouted Raffy as he leapt off. Bring some water! Quick, Jingle, hurry! The pixies ran and brought back water in their foxglove hats. The poor doves were too weak to stand, but Jingle gently dipped their bills into the flower pails. Well done, Raffy, said Faddie. It wasn't me, said Raffy. It was the doves who did it. They did everything. I thought they'd die of exhaustion, but they bravely struggled on and brought us safely home. Everyone cheered, and all the birds in the trees burst into song. But the doves were faint with exhaustion, and lay panting on their sides with their eyes closed. Oh, Faddie, said Raffy in tears, are they going to die? They've tried so hard. Faddie put his nose against their feathers and blew gently. Come on, little ones. We'll look after you. Come on now. Spinny Jenny brought one of her cobweb counterpanes to keep them warm. He and Raffy sat with them all night, and miraculously, by the morning, they were bright-eyed and very perky again. Now, said Faddie, you 3 sit down and tell what news you have brought us. Plenty, they said, together. Then, taking it in turns to speak, they described in detail how they'd flown for hours across the most beautiful blue sea. They told of how the seagulls had cheered them on their way and passed them from one flock to the next, making sure their direction was correct. They at last saw the giant's castle, built high on a rock and looming out of the sea. The giant was wading in the water, bellowing and shouting. He was guiding a shoal of fish with his huge hands and forcing them to swim into a cave under the rocks. We flew down for a closer look and spotted the monstrous octopus, almost as big as the giant himself. Her tentacles were spread out in the water, and she was helping him to herd the fish into the cave. She is a terrible creature and tends the vast supplies of fish for the giant. She must have seen us, because she shot up one of her hideous tentacles high into the air and tried to grab us. The doves dived sideways and then swooped up and out of reach. It was a close miss, and we were terrified. We turned away from the sea at once to fly back home. It was a desperate flight. Sometimes the winds were against us, and the dove's strength was almost failing, but they never gave up. "You couldn't have done more," said Faddie. Thank you so much from us all. Now for my plan. We have to find a way of persuading the giant to stay in his castle. I'm not sure how that can be done, but obviously I will have to meet him. My friends, the two dolphins, have promised to help us. They are afraid of the giant too. The seagulls will send out messages through their cousins halfway round the world, and will be sure to find him. In no time at all, the two jolly dolphins came leaping and diving across the sea and surfing through the waves. "Faddie, our dear friend, what can we do for you? Is it the sea giant again? We'll do anything we can to help you be rid of him." "Thank you," said Faddie. "We do have a plan. I need you to help me swim to the giant's castle. Raffi, the elf, and the doves have found the way. I intend to speak to him, and, if necessary, fight with him and drive him away. The fairies are preparing a spell which will make me grow, and I'll soon be even bigger and stronger than you are." "Oh, Faddie," said the dolphin sadly, "you don't know how terrible he is. He kills everything that swims into the sea around his castle. He carries a huge club and strikes out at anyone he thinks might be stealing his fish. A friend of ours once strayed too close by mistake and was given a dreadful blow on the head. He did recover, but only because the monstrous octopus, who helps capture his injured victims, was diverted by the fish trying to make a mass escape from the cave. It wouldn't matter how big and strong you are, Faddie. You could never survive. Please, we're begging you, please don't try. It would be hopeless." But Faddie was insistent. "I must try. There is no other way." With heavy hearts, the dolphins consented to help. "Meet me here in the morning, and don't be alarmed when you see how big I've grown." The fairies cast their spells, and Marybelle threw magic dust over Faddie. It was the exact opposite of the spell that had made him small and light all that time ago, when they flew with him to the fairy woods. This time he felt his legs stretching and his back arching. His chest swelled, and his teeth and claws grew long and sharp. He seemed to tower over everyone, and had to drop his head right down to see them, and even then it was difficult, as his nose, too, had grown so long. "We've taken away your wings, Faddie. You won't need them in the sea," said little Flo. When everyone else was still asleep, he waited alone on the shore for the dolphins. As the morning sky lightened with the rising sun, they appeared. "Faddie, you're as big as we are," they exclaimed. "Now, tell us exactly what you want us to do." "Swim with me to the sea giant's castle," he said. "We know where he lives, but I can't swim there alone. With one of you on either side of me, we could get there easily." The dolphins were appalled. "Faddie, we'll all be killed. We told you this before, and you don't understand. We won't have a chance. There's the monstrous octopus as well." But Faddie interrupted. "The gulls say she is so greedy for fish that whenever they spot a shoal and fly above it, squawking and diving, she dashes in immediately to steal them. The plan is to lure her away from the castle while I speak to the giant." "Talk to the giant? Faddie, are you crazy? He won't even hear you. He'll spot us in an instant, and crash, down will come his club. You have no idea how dangerous he is." "I've thought of that," Faddie insisted. "When we get near enough to the castle, I'll swim in on my own and duck under the water whenever he looks round. The dolphins were in despair. "You can't do it, Faddie," they said sadly. "And we can't stay with you. We have our family in another part of the sea, and we can't take on such a hopeless risk. If you insist, we'll swim with you there, but please forgive us, Faddie. We're so sorry." "Of course, you must get back to your family. But please take me to the castle." Faddie slipped into the water, and the dolphins moved in on either side, holding him up between them. They turned and swam straight out to sea, just as the doves had flown, in the direction of the giant's castle. They swam all through the day. "I can see why the poor doves were exhausted," thought Faddie. But he loved the feel of skimming through the sea with the dolphins. This is another beautiful world, as blue as the sky, but made of water. I know now why the dolphins are always so jolly. Suddenly, in the distance, they saw the pennants flying from the towers of the giant's castle. They were there, at last. The seagulls were waiting, and true to plan, they started whirling and diving into the water, pretending they'd spotted a shoal of fish. The monstrous octopus appeared at once, eager to catch the fish, and they drew her away, round behind the castle wall, and into the distant sea. "Excellent," whispered Faddie to the dolphins, and his courage was high. "You can leave now." But almost at once the plan began to falter. There was no sign of the sea giant. Where could he be? Their eyes searched the horizon. In a moment, the water began to heave, and with a terrible roar, the giant rose up out of the sea almost directly in front of them. Crash! And Faddie heard the whistle of the club swinging down upon him. Crash! And it hit the water again, missing him by a fraction. The dolphins dived deep under the sea and fled, but there was no escape for Faddie. He thought he would surely die, as the dolphins had warned. But he felt a great fury inside him, like a raging fire, and he knew he would never give up without a fight. Whatever the odds, his courage would not fail. With a growl, almost as loud as the giant's roar, he leapt out of the water and caught the handle of the giant's club in his teeth. Up he went in the air, swinging around the giant's head, then crashed back into the water again. The force was so great he could scarcely breathe. He clenched his teeth and closed his eyes, waiting to die. Again and again the giant swung his club. He tried shaking it to dislodge Faddie, and then tried to drown him by holding him under the water. But Faddie held on and held on. Hundreds of seabirds gathered, desperate to help and unable to do anything. Faddie struggled on alone, fighting for his life. But what was this? There was a long, low swell in the sea that rippled forward in a steady flow like the tide coming in. It stretched as far as anyone could see, but no creature was visible except the occasional puff of spray and glimpse of a shining, arched back. "Hold on, Faddie," the bird screamed. "The dolphins are coming back to help! Hold on!" And Faddie, almost unconscious and at his last gasp, just managed to keep his teeth tightly clenched onto the huge club. The sea giant, in his raging, saw nothing until it was too late. The gentle, friendly dolphins had been summoned from the ends of the ocean to save Faddie. They knew exactly what was needed to be done. Swimming close together and keeping just below the surface, they formed a wall as solid as a rock. They circled the giant, closing in, steadying themselves, ready for the fatal charge. It was sudden and swift when it came, and the impact threw the giant over sideways and upside down into the water. He let out a terrible roar, but whenever he struggled to get up, the dolphins charged in again, tipping him up and pushing him under. He bellowed and screamed, and after one last ducking, the dolphins chased him as, half under and half above the water, he ran for his life through the sea. He never looked back and was never seen again. And where was the monstrous octopus? She was last seen on the trail of the giant, streaking through the sea with mighty thrusts and trailing her hideous tentacles behind her. Who knows where they went? She is probably hunting and housekeeping for him still, terrifying the fish in another part of the sea. And where was our hero, Faddie? Well, still hanging on to the terrible club, and longing to join in with trouncing and chasing the giant. But his two friends said, "Stop that now, Faddie, you've done enough." And they kept him safely away from the fray. "We're taking you home, Faddie. The birds have flown ahead to break the news. What a hero you are! What a great hero! You will be a legend with the little people forever." "But you saved the day. You wonderful dolphins saved the day. How did you come up with such a brilliant plan? Thank you, thank you. How can I ever thank you enough?" The dolphins lined themselves up. They bowed their heads, then flipped their tails in a last salute before turning away for the open sea. They knew very well that if Faddie had not held on to the giant's club, they would not have been able to get anywhere near him. "Come on, Faddie. Home now. Everyone's waiting for you. We're going to give you a magical ride through the sea and show you all our leaps and dives." They were in such high spirits and triumphant that the sea giant had fled. "Hang on, Faddie, you'll love this!" And off they went, bounding and diving across the sea. This must be another kind of magic. A whole beautiful world, so cool and blue. No wonder the dolphins are always happy, he thought. They've made me happy too. The shore was crowded with little people and animals, all cheering for Faddie. Maribel and little Flo were ready with their arms outstretched to welcome him. Faddie had planned a dignified disembarkation, looking as modest as possible, but those mischievous dolphins had thought of something different. Just as they reached the shore, they tossed him over their heads. Round he went once, twice, and landed, much to his surprise, on his 4 feet. At that moment he was back to his right size, and everyone rushed to hug him. They thought his somersaults had been planned, and Faddie was pleased to go along with the idea. The dolphins gave 2 great joyful leaps into the air, flicked their tails before diving and disappearing across the sea. The wise fairy decides. Faddie was a great hero, and he lived with the little people for many, many years. Everyone loved him. He had been so kind and helpful, and no one in their world had not felt his touch. He loved most particularly all the babies, from the Imps to the fox cubs, and was always ready for a game with them. He often managed to save the tiny birds from the wind and rainstorms. He'd find them on the ground for the sprites to lift back into their nests. He might have lived with the little people forever, but one day the wise fairy called for Faddie. He took Raffy along, and they found her sitting on her mushroom, looking very quiet and grave. He guessed at once there was something important to be said. She began slowly. "We always hoped you would stay with us forever." "But I will," interrupted Faddie. "No, Faddie," she replied. "We've heard from the foxes that Beth is old and not well. She can't keep the farm safe on her own. They need another dog, and Maeve is weeping and calling for you. I think you must go." Faddie was stunned. "Please, don't send me away. I can't leave you. I love everyone here. I've tried so hard to be helpful. I can't remember any other life. Please, please. And the Imps need me too." "Faddie, dear Faddie, this is the hardest thing. We all need you." He could see the tears in her eyes, and knew that fairies must never cry. He thought his heart would break. "We should leave tonight. There's no time to delay. Beth is ill. I'll fly with you, Faddie, and Mary Bell will come too." There were so many sad farewells. Everybody came. The foxes, the deer, the badgers, the hares, the rabbits, the dolphins leapt into the air to say goodbye, and all the little people came. The poor imps wailed, and the pixies and elves were downcast. Even the goblins were quiet for once. But the fairies and sprites danced and sang, holding on to a rope made specially by Spinny Jenny and threaded with flowers and pretty leaves. They didn't want Faddie to see them sad. At last everyone held on to the rope and joined in the dance. It became a great celebration. The fairies sang, "Faddie is our hero, Faddie is our friend. We'll remember him forever, and all our love we'll send." There was joy and laughter, and no one was sad. As the stars came out, the wise fairy whispered, "It's time, Faddie." All was quiet as she and Mary Bell led him away, up, up into the sky and over the hills, flying together through the starry night. When the sky was turning into a pink dawn, they spied a plume of white smoke rising from a valley, and suddenly the croft appeared. "We'll fly down with you," said the wise fairy softly, "and when we land, we will have to snap off your wings. It might sting a little. The moment they touch the ground, we will be gone. Don't leave me, Mary Bell. Please don't leave me." Faddie was trembling. But the wise fairy said, "We took you away, Faddie, and now we must bring you back. We love you so much and have given you some of our magic. It is for you to keep and use forever. But this is where you belong. This is the way it has to be." Mary Bell held him close and whispered, "Faddie, Faddie, never fear. Look up at the stars, and we'll always be there." They landed on the soft turf in front of the croft. There was a quick snip-snap, and as Freddie's wings touched the ground, his friends had vanished. But he heard their voices still singing, sounding fainter as they flew over the clouds. "Faddie, Faddie, never fear. Look up at the stars, and we'll always be there." Faddie sat very still and looked around him. He had stopped trembling, as it all seemed strangely familiar. Had he been here before, he wondered? A little girl ran out of the house and flung her arms around his neck. It was Maeve, and he remembered her at once. When he heard her cries of excitement and felt her tears of joy on his face, he knew that this was another kind of magic. He loved her too, and had done what was right. He needed to be home. Epilogue. Faddie lived for a long time and became a venerable old gentleman. He had many, many sons and daughters who were all as clever, kind, loyal and courageous as he had been. They're still around, these wonderful dogs. Look out for their golden brown coats and bright, intelligent eyes. They're full of fun and full of ideas, and very full of themselves. But the strangest thing is that they all have that mysterious touch of magic that was given to Faddie by the little people. And they love to loiter in the garden at night. Who knows if, like Faddie, they might still be talking with the fairies.